Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Spallis, and welcome to my tropical beach area over here. I have no idea where this is located, but I am acting like that is my villa because that would be cool, wouldn't it be? That looks like a whole mansion right there. Maybe I don't want that because that sounds like a lot of upkeep. Anyways, that's not what this video is about. This video is about this book, World Hypotheses by Stephen C. Pepper. The one book that I've been telling myself every New Year's that I'm going to read, and every New Year's, by the end of each year, I never did. Except I started doing it now. You can see I've read the first chapter and I had a question about the last page. But anyways, we're going to be focusing on the first chapter in this video. Why have I started reading it? Because there are plenty of things that I've been wanting to do and that I'm not doing right now. So why did I start this? What in the environment, what in the contingencies changed, Ben? Well, Richard, and I don't know, I'm sorry, Richard, I don't know how to say your last name. Richard von something. And I'm not going to try it because I think that would be disrespectful because I'm going to get it wrong. But an awesome dude named Richard, who also has a last name that I can't pronounce, started this group where each month we're going to be discussing one chapter of the World Hypotheses book, which is great. It's a great opportunity for me to actually get into it, finally start this thing. So we just had the first meeting. And it was awesome. It was great. We had a good number of people show up and had an awesome discussion about it. And it left me feel, after reading it and attending the meeting, it made me feel like, oh, well, this would be a cool thing to share with more people. And so I thought I could share my understanding of the preface and the first chapter for the people who are also interested in this book and telling themselves that they want to read it and they should read it and that they're going to read it but never end up doing it. Hey, maybe playing this video might be an easier way to get started. That said, I just love it whenever people are showing up and trying to create resources and opportunities for people in the contextual behavioral sciences community. I just think it's such a cool initiative that Richard is running here. And so please consider if this video is interesting, if the topic of the book is interesting, please consider it's once a month on the second Sunday, carving out some time so that you can show up and show some support and also learn something while you're there. So anyways, let's get into the preface and the first chapter of this book. This will be my interpretation, understanding of it. I naturally am very energetic when I talk, and so it can sound like I'm 100% confident in what I'm talking about. But this is just my understanding of it. And if you want to hear other people's understanding of it, you should go to the meeting. Okay, let's get into the book. I found the preface of this book to be fascinating. I was kind of nervous thinking that, oh man, maybe this is just going to run after paragraph of paragraph. It's just gibberish to me. But no, I felt like it was quite understandable. In fact, it told a story that I found fascinating. Before we get into the preface, though, it's interesting to know that the subtitle for this book, you cannot read it on the cover, but it says a Prolegomena to Systematic Philosophy and a Complete Survey of Metaphysics, which I think is such a boring subtitle, right? That could mean anything. A Prolegomena to Systematic Philosophy. What does that even mean? I love the subtitle of the book once you open the first few pages and you see the title within the book, and it's very simple, very elegant. World Hypotheses, a Study in Evidence. It's just brilliant. Whichever editor, I don't know why they made that switch, but I wish that made it into the cover. Evidence is important here. What Pepper talks about in this preface is his kind of personal story, his personal history as to how he found himself exploring the questions that are explored in this book. He says the origin of this book goes way back to a consuming personal desire to know the truth. He talks about how when he was a young boy, the nearest piece of infrastructure that he could grab at that could give him an answer to his questions around truth was religion. He was raised with the doctrines of a church, and then he struggled with what I later found were the perennial issues of theology. So he was raised religious, and he struggled with the doctrines of the church. Then for a time, I studied in physics, so he switched to physics. But physics seemed interested chiefly in measurements and formulas, and impatient with what might be the bearing of these on the problems like perceptions that makes one want to know the truth. What I understand from that is he's saying physics was too much about formulas and measurements and math and stuff like that, and it didn't cover truth in the kinds of problems that I cared about. And so then he goes into philosophy, and he describes this history of going into philosophy and then trying to believe in this philosophy that he was taught by these teachers, and he says, I tried to make them mine. I used to repeat them in the hope that they would take feeling rather than knowing. Uh, but they did not take, and I had this revulsion against them, and I turned into a dogmatic materialist. So now he believes nothing, and he has nothing he has faith in, and he keeps going. He talks about how psychology influenced him. He mentions that were violent changes that were taking place at the time. Social values were having their the violent changes that were taking place in social values were having their effect, which I then was like, what does that mean? So this book was published in 1942. I looked it up. He was born in 1891, which means that he was 9 years old at the beginning of the 20th century. He was 19 years old at 1910. In 1910, he was 29 years old at the start of the 1920s, and he was 39 years old at the start of the 1930s. So I'm thinking about like the violent changes that were taking place were having that effect. It was probably when people coming back from World War I, which was 1914 to 1918, and so all these people were coming back, and they were called the Lost Generation. This is what I was like Googling. Apparently, they were called the Lost Generation because it was a bunch of people who came back from war and saw this like senseless death and dying, and so the people who were these young boys who came back from war, they had very little concern towards the kind of more conservative traditional values that the kind of older generations had. So they cared less about gender roles, and they cared less about the kind of traditional formalities. And that was one feature that contributed to the women's suffrage movement that was going on during the 1920s, and also just the Roaring Twenties. So there was this kind of social change that was. He's probably referring to the 1920s. He then says individualistic democracy, through which the first quarter of the century I naively accepted as the unquestionable ideal, met with severe jars. I don't know what that means, but it sounds like criticism, and became subject to criticism. So I think that is criticism. It was an ideal that obviously required revision. It was in active competition with other political ideals. And so what were the grounds and evidences for any of these political creeds? So he's also talking personally about like, man, we're having this social upheaval, we're having this kind of political upheaval, and not only do I not know what to think about all this stuff, it's all very overwhelming, which I can very much relate to, but also, how do I know what positions have more validity versus not? Because of course that there are differences, and people are taking different value systems, but then how do we evaluate these value systems? So he just gives an interesting story about all these different areas that he jumps to, and places that he went, and then he becomes a professor, which he doesn't mention in the book, but you can intuit it because I looked it up, and he became a professor in 1919, so just before 1920, which, yeah, anyways. So, and he just talked about a number of things, trends that are happening at the time around truth and things that he learned, and so he says, and how none of these really gave him the answer, right? And so he says, now all this material seems to have come to a sort of stability in the book that follows. Here, I believe, is the truth about these things, or as near as we can get to it in our times, or rather, here's the attitude, and here are some of the instruments that can bring us to it. Bring it to us, sorry. This is an important quote. He says, at the very least, here's the solution that seems best to one man, living in the first half of the 20th century, who's passed through most of the cognitive experiences that we have been subject to: religious creed, philosophical dogma, science, art, and social reevaluation. And I think that that's just a brilliant thing, because he's talking from the perspective of basically like he's talking about the first half of the 20th century. This is World War II is not even over yet, right? When this book comes out, because I don't remember the specific date that World War II ended, but it started in 1939. I should know this. I was just looking at it. Anyways, he's in the middle of the 20th century, and he's going through these religious, philosophical changes and seeing changes in science and art and social reevaluation. And is that not something that we can relate to today? So I just found that such a great little preface. Okay, so I recommend reading it. Now let's get to chapter 1. I'm going to reread it again, and then I will unpause. I will pause this and read it again, and review my notes, and then come back. Okay, so Pepper starts the chapter with explaining what a world hypothesis is. And he starts the chapter off by acknowledging that there are many things in this world. For example, there's a highlighter that has these little like sticky things that I use for my notes. And we have clickers in the world where I can count things. And we have flashlights that can shine light and stuff. And we have Lego bricks. We have many things in this world, right? And he says, and this is a quote, page 1, top of the page, among the variety of objects which we find in the world are hypotheses about the world itself. He then goes about in naming philosophers that have talked about hypotheses of the world. He talks about Plato's Republic, and he talks about Aristotle's metaphysics, Spinoza's ethics, Dewey's experience in nature. He talks about these philosophers and their work trying to explain or come up with hypotheses about the world. And he points out how hypotheses like these that talk about the world are distinctly different from hypotheses of other kind. He mentions, for example, Darwin's on the origin of the species, right? That is a different kind of hypothesis than a world hypothesis. And the reason why is because the kind of evolutionary theory or many different scientific hypotheses, they are relevant to just a specific field, right? So, for example, if I go to a mathematician and I say, I have looked at your theory, and I'm wondering how does your theory explain the sensations I'm currently feeling in my right big toe? And the mathematician would go, no, my theory does not encompass the sensations that you're feeling in your right big toe. And then I would go to the mathematician, does that not mean that your theory is incomplete? Because you cannot explain the sensations in my right big toe. And the mathematician goes, no, because the sensations in your right big toe have nothing to do with mathematics. It's outside of the field. And there are lots of hypotheses that work like this. The theory of evolution, which is no longer a hypothesis, it is a theory. The theory of evolution does not need to explain, for example, the behavior of atoms, because the behavior of atoms is not in the field of evolution. And so it's not relevant to that domain. So there are plenty of hypotheses that only consider information that are relevant to its field, that are relevant to its domain. But then there are world hypotheses, these kind of broader things that deal with knowledge in an unrestricted way. Middle of page 1 in the first page of chapter 1, he says, quote, "These unrestricted products of knowledge I'm calling world hypotheses. And the peculiarity of world hypotheses is that they cannot reject anything as irrelevant." So you must encompass the highlighter and my flashlight and the sensations in my right big toe, the behavior of atoms and the evolution of species. And this is a quote, bottom of page 1. "Students of world hypotheses can never have that way out." He's referring to the mathematicians, saying that it's not relevant to their field. "Every consideration is relevant to a world hypothesis." This is still page 1, bottom of it. "And no facts lie outside of it. This peculiarity has extensive consequences." So, when we're talking about world hypotheses, we're talking about theories, claims, perspectives, worldviews that encompass everything that fall within that all-encompassing category of the world. So, Pepper then says, I almost said Skinner. You tell you what I've been reading about. Oh my gosh. Don't get me started. Anyway, I'm going to get back on track. Skinner says, top of page 2, "I wish to study world hypotheses as objects existing in the world, examine them empirically, as a zoologist studies species of animals, a psychologist studies varieties of perception, a mathematician to geometrical systems." I'm adding little words. I said, okay, I'm butchering the quote a little bit to make it make sense with what I'm saying. He said, a mathematician, geometrical systems. I'm adding a word saying a mathematician to geometrical systems. So I'm not quoting exactly, but I'm not trying to ever misquote here. Okay, just acknowledging that. Now let's continue. Still top of page 2. So he's talking about this analogy between world hypotheses and this idea that the analogy between world hypotheses as actual facts or objects in the world. And he says that this analogy is worth holding in mind because we all have and use world hypotheses, just as we have animal bodies, have perceptions, and move within a geometrical space, or move within geometrical relations, whatever. I think that's space. Anyways, though, so he's pointing to these examples of animal bodies or perceptions that we have, because these are things that we use to operate within the world. And so he wants to discuss world hypotheses because and how they exist currently in the world because they are operated upon. They are used in our everyday lives as we go through the world. And it is because world hypotheses are so intimate, though, it's like a fish swimming in water, that we do not easily look at them from a distance. Sounds like diffusion, right? So to speak, or if we saw them in a mirror. Even the authors named in my first paragraph do not fully succeed in looking at the results as things to be looked at. Kind of sounds like diffusion, right? But I don't think that's what he's saying. I'm reading that as diffusion because that's what I think ACT people do, is we find examples of ACT in non-ACT sources and get all happy about it. Anyways, so he references how world hypotheses are usually presented in the way that they're presented and discussed. People engage straight with the content. They look at it as if it's true or not true. They're likely to be studied as creeds, or to be accepted or rejected, be expressions of highly individual personalities, expressions of epics, or personal historical scholarship, or as objects of historical scholarship. Anyways, so he's talking about like the content of it, where it came from, these kinds of things. But and this is another quote, they are rarely treated as objects in their own right, to be studied and described in their own character and compared with one another. From what I understand, Pepper is presenting a pretty original work here. I mean, I'm not a philosopher in metaphysics, so I don't know. But from what I understand, he is presenting something original. But the way that he's doing it is not arguing this is the way that reality is. What he's trying to say is that this is the way that different people conceptualize reality. This is the different world hypotheses that people have out there. And so it's kind of like approaching it like a textbook, but a textbook doesn't have an original claim. This guy is making his own original kind of surveying of the field, that conception. But it's interesting. It reads, this book kind of reads differently in that way, and that it's kind of this surveying of the field. At least that's what he's trying to propose here. And so he says, this is the sort of study I wish to make. Now, we're approaching the end of the second page of the first chapter. This is where he transitions into what the first chapter is actually about. The first chapter is titled The Utter Skeptic. And so he's going to introduce that theme, and then we're going to play around with it and get to a satisfying conclusion. So he says, however, we cannot enter immediately into this study. So we cannot immediately start surveying the field of world hypotheses. It is inevitable that the study should include some theory of its own. We must try to reduce this to a minimum and be aware of the minimum. What he is saying here is that if we are surveying theories of the world, it is inevitable that we are going to have our own assumptions, our own theory, as we survey theories of the world. And so we're going to take a world hypothesis. We might take on, not a world hypothesis, but we might take on assumptions or theories when we're analyzing theories. And so what he says is this is inevitable. This is not something that you can just avoid. We're going to do this as we survey the field. We're going to have our own assumptions as we walk into this. And it's inevitable, so we should just reduce this to a minimum, one. And number two, be aware of the minimum. Now, to do this, he starts with actually attacking two attitudes that that try and take this perspective that they are free of theory. So he's saying that we're not free of theory as we're doing this, and the way that we're going to go about showing how we're not free of theory is by pointing to those who say that they're free of theory, how those people are wrong. And he says there are two cognitive attitudes that people take that they suggest is free of any kind of theory, free of any of theory. I don't know what the synonym for that would be. The two positions that he says are kind of theory-free, or people suggest are theory-free, are utter skepticism and dogmatism. So his intention is to basically show that these are not justifiable interpretations, and that sets the argument for this middle course that is in between absolute utter skepticism and dogmatism, which is partial skepticism. Okay? Now, I just gave you a bunch of terms. And when I get terms that I'm not familiar with, I start gazing out and doing other things. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just so you can understand what those three terms mean, and then we're going to continue. How I understand it, after going through the chapter, is an utter skeptic is someone who doesn't believe in anything, right? They're not a partial skeptic where they believe some things and they're skeptical of others. They are an utter skeptic, and they are a skeptic so utterly and so profoundly that it is a world hypothesis. It is a systematic belief system about the entire world. And the system, the perspective, the philosophy is that you have no beliefs. You don't believe in something, but you also don't believe that something is not true, right? So an utter skeptic does not believe that there is a God, so they're not theist. But they also don't believe that there is not a God. They're not atheists, because to be atheist is to have a belief. It's to believe that there is this world without God. At least that's the argument he's making. I think that I don't know anything about I'm not going to try and say that I know anything about theology. This is just what he suggests. He's using this example. And so he says, for everything, not just for God. God was just an example. The utter skeptic is towards everything. In this position of doubt, where it's neither believing nor not believing, or like believing in the opposite. It is just this kind of unbelief. And the utter skeptic also does not consider evidence, because the utter skeptic is in this position where it's not believing because the evidence is 50-50. So evidence is not considered in this point of view, because it's an utter skeptic. He's not a partial, or she, or they, or whatever it is. They're not a partial skeptic. They can't be convinced based on the right amount of evidence. No matter how much evidence they see, they are still skeptical. That is the utter skeptic. The partial skeptic can believe in things because they consider evidence. And then there's the dogmatist, which has beliefs. But from my understanding, and I haven't read the dogmatism chapter yet, but from what I'm getting from this, is the dogmatist has beliefs, but it's not predicated on evidence, and they don't need evidence to justify those beliefs. That's how I currently understand it. Okay, so there's these three perspectives: utter skepticism and dogmatism, which is not believing anything because you think that, where the evidence can't convince you of anything, because evidence can't convince you of anything. That's utter skepticism. Dogmatism is that you have beliefs, but from my understanding, they don't need to be justified or predicated on evidence. He says that these attitudes suggest, or that people who take these attitudes purport to be entirely free from theory of any sort. And so he's suggesting that that's wrong, that they do have theory in them, or that they just fall apart, and that's what brings us to the position that we're going to be taking as we survey the land of world hypotheses, which is what Pepper calls the partial skepticist, or having partial skepticism, which is what we will pursue. So it signifies that these objects, referring to world hypotheses, which we are about to study, are not final products of knowledge, and yet they do contain knowledge. This is middle of page 3, the quote I just read. So in this chapter, he's going to go through and attack these two. He's going to try and destroy the utter skepticists and destroy the dogmatists, right? He doesn't say that. That's how I'm interpreting it. In this chapter, he just targets the utter skepticist and says that we shall consider the claims of dogmatism in the next chapter, basically. So let's get into the position of the utter skeptic. What is a skeptic? He provides this answer that he's quoting some other guy that I have no idea who this person is. Hylas? I have no idea. But that person says, one who doubts all things. And so this is he suggests that this describes the attitude of the utter skeptic. Now, people he makes this kind of observation that people think that the skepticist's attitude is an easy attitude to take, and that knowledge is hard, but doubt is easy. And he thinks that this idea is mistaken. And he thinks the reason why is because there's this analogy that is commonly used that suggests that knowledge is like building a building. And so it is hard to construct a building, but it's easy to destroy a building. And so we think that it is the same thing with knowledge. It is hard to build knowledge, but easy to destroy it. But he says, and this is middle of page 4, or second paragraph, page 4, but actually, in cognition, it is generally easier to construct than destroy. For the cognitive imagination is eternally active and is a tremendous fabricator. So he's describing how like we can just think about whatever we want. It is easier for us to believe and think what we want to think than for us to doubt. Belief is the naive attitude, while doubt is an acquisition won through long and hard experience. Now, so let me read this one more time. Okay, yes. How I understand what he says next is that because it is hard to be a skeptic, because it is not easy, but it is actually hard to be doubtful of everything, to hold that position. The position of the skeptic is not a very secure position. In fact, it is so far from secure that it's difficult to even scrutinize what the utter skeptic is talking about. And so he says, and this is third paragraph, page 4, what can the utter skeptic himself mean? Does he, and he says he because it's 1942, but anyways, we know that does not apply to just he, but does he, in the case, I guess, mean that all facts are illusory and all statements false? But this is not a position of doubt. It is of downright disbelief. So if someone disbelieves, in this case, because it's 1942, apparently only men, right? That's sarcasm, by the way. Anyways, if these philosopher males are take the position that all facts are illusions and that all statements inherently are false, that's not the position of a skeptic. That is the position of someone who disbelieves in something. And so that's not the position of a skeptic. The skeptic, and goes back to the God example, right? And this is just an example. He's not trying to suggest that that like just because the dogmatist or the other skepticist's position falls apart, that atheist or theist positions fall apart. I don't think he's making a theological argument. I think he's just making a comparison where he's saying, like, to compare, both the atheist and the theist both believe in something. The atheist believes in a world without God, while the theist believes in a world with God, right? That is not the utter skepticist. The utter skepticist cannot be in either of those categories because, as the definition was provided, an utter skeptic is one who doubts all things. So if this utter skeptic doubts all things, it's doubting both the presence of God and the absence of God. And so he genuinely doubts is that he finds the evidence on both sides so evenly balanced that he neither believes nor disbelieves, but holds the proposition in suspense. So it is the one who doubts all things is one who never believes nor disbelieves anything. Now, Pepper mentions that this is something that we can do. We all sometimes take this position of skepticism. And so he describes what I'm calling situational skepticism, which is different from utter skepticism, which is skepticism towards everything, all things, right? One who doubts all things. Situational skepticism is something that we can all relate to. For example, he gives this example, second paragraph, page 5. Will a penny fall heads or tails? Will it rain tomorrow? Did I tell the gardener to water the flowers? Have I a nickel in my pocket? For different reasons, the available evidence here is so balanced that I would not risk judgment in either way, except for fun or out of practical necessity. I am genuinely in utter doubt in all of these instances. So if I'm flipping a coin and it hasn't landed yet and you don't know, then you are in utter skepticism. But that skepticism is situational. It's situational to me flipping a coin. So then what Pepper then describes is when in situations you'll have certainty. So situational, what I'm calling situational certainty. He says, but to generalize the attitude forced upon me in these instances into an attitude that can be taken towards everything in the world is quite a different matter. So viewing everything like it's the flip of a coin is quite a different thing. He says, and this is 1, 2, 3, fourth paragraph on the 5th page. I feel certain that I see blue, and very sure that it is blue. It is the blue of the sky that I see, and rather sure that it is the stimulus for blue that is not, and rather sure that the stimulus for blue is not light reflected from a hard surface, and fairly open to the idea that light is electrical in nature, and willing to entertain the hypothesis that electromagnetic vibrations are real as the waves of the sea. Okay, I kind of butchered that. But what he's saying is that he's very confident that he can see blue. And he's pretty damn confident that he's seeing that off the sky, which is this like non-hard surface. And he's fairly open to the idea that light is electrical in nature. And he's willing to entertain the hypothesis that electromagnetic vibrations are as real as the waves of the sea. So he's talking about situational certainty where, depending upon the evidence, it's shaping his belief. And so he's a partial skeptic. That's what he later then describes. He's in this position of the partial skeptic, where you are able to be swayed by evidence, but when the evidence is not there, you're skeptical. So, or like in the case of the hypothesis that electromagnetic vibrations are as real as the waves of the sea, he's willing to entertain it. He's not certain of it because, and for the hypothesis that electromagnetic vibrations are real, top of page 6, here the evidence is so complicated and so interconnected with masses of other evidence that the image of a balance with two trays, one receiving evidence for pro and the one for receiving evidence for con, seems to break down entirely. So it's one second. So in that one, he's saying that the evidence is not in this kind of balance of like, oh, here's the evidence that we have as pro. So it's like the evidence is suggesting that this is true. And then there's this other balance of evidence that's con, that's suggesting that this claim is not true. With the claim that electromagnetic vibrations are real as real as the waves in the sea that I have in this tropical background here. It's just so convoluted and complicated that like being doubtful in the same way that you would be doubtful of a flip of a coin where there are options of clearly it is heads or tails. He said that doesn't even make sense. And so we can be situationally certain, right? Certain things we have more confidence in, certain things we have less confidence in. And it's not just because things are kind of like 50-50, because they can be more complicated than that, or they have less evidence, or either, you know? So to doubt all that I see now, to doubt all that I now see blue. Okay, to doubt that all that I now see blue. That's a crazy sentence that I've never heard phrased like that. But he's saying to basically doubt that everything that I see as blue is blue seems utterly out of the question. The balance of evidence availed to me in favor of believing that I see blue in what we call as the blue sky is very great against the slight negative possibilities that's not true. So this is not a 50-50, he suggests. But the utter skeptic views it as it is really a 50-50 if that is blue in what I'm pointing to, the sky, or that is not blue. And so it doesn't take a position. So he's pointing to how the utter skeptic's position just logically falls apart. He says, if by doubt is meant a sense of balance of evidence, nobody lives in doubt of all things. Such a man, because apparently this only applies to men, right? That was a joke again. Sarcasm. Sorry. Such a man would simply fade away and die. He would not, I don't know why this is bothering me. He would not stand up, for the floor might not support him, nor sit down, for there might be no chair, nor eat, for the food might be cinders, nor speak, for he might not be heard. A consistent utter skeptic of the kind here supposed exhibits his beliefs and disbeliefs and denies his balance of doubt every time he takes a step or says a word. That just means that he's there is this cognitive dissonance within the other skeptic, where if the other skeptic does anything, if they take any sort of action or they say any sort of thing, then they violate their own beliefs. Their beliefs contradict their actions. If you believe that, and this is all encompassing, right? So it's a world hypothesis referring to everything in the world. So if you believe that this isn't a flashlight and that it really is 50-50 if this light will turn on when I press the button or not, and it really is 50-50 if these Lego bricks are red. Like, if you don't believe anything, then you can't do anything. You can't get up and take a shower because you don't believe that the floor is going to hold you when you walk over there. And so he says that this person must simply fade away and die. He then addresses this idea that maybe the utter skeptic is not referencing to practical things. Okay, the utter skeptic will take a shower because it's practical, but is still the utter skeptic when it comes to the grounds of ultimate belief. But let me read this one second. Okay, how I understand this section is he's saying what we're talking about here, you can't just be skeptical of things of ultimate importance, but then for practical things, you're just not. I think that's what he's saying here. It is no simple, naive, or simple, naive, easy, or secure attitude. It is forced, sophisticated, and very insecure. For now, the utter skeptic is making a statement about the nature of all things, and the most peculiar nature on this view of all things must have. Take any statement. On this view, the evidence for that statement must be evenly balanced. But so also, oh my god, this fucking English, I can't read it. But so also must be the evidence for the statement, and so ad infinitum. How I understand what he's saying there is that if we're talking about a world hypothesis, we're talking about something that should be applied to everything that falls into that all-encompassing category of the world, then we're making a claim about all things in that world. And so then any statement that you can make about the world must fit this criteria of being 50-50 for both evidence supporting it and evidence that's against it. And so we're just doubting everything. And so he says that in itself, that theory can be put forward as two ways. We can either suggest that everything in the world, every claim that you can make about the world, is 50-50 in terms of evidence, and you can say that as a dogmatic truth, which then you're not the utter skeptic anymore. You're the dogmatist, which he then says we'll cover in the next chapter. Or you can suggest that the evidence for every claim is 50-50 and suggest that simply as a hypothesis that is to be examined on the basis of evidence. If the dogmatist, they're not the skepticist anymore, and so that'll be covered in the next chapter. And if the utter skepticist says that their belief that every claim has 50-50 evidence is simply a hypothesis that can be tested, then the utter skepticist is no longer the utter skepticist anymore. They are the partial skepticist. And that is something that is respected here. Okay, now page 8 and page 9 cover, I think, basically what we have already covered. He brings up this new premise, and then he destroys the premise, and then he goes back to the old premise that the other skeptic turns into the partial skeptic or the dogmatist. So that's page 8, page 9. Maybe I'm missing something that's like really, really important there that I'm not catching, but I don't think so. I think he makes an interesting argument that is novel, but that I haven't said before, but it leads to the same place. Okay, so now we're on the last page, page 10, which is the last page of this chapter, and he says, there may be men who honestly regard themselves as utter skeptics, but if there really are such, if there really are such, they are hard to find. And so what he says is that when we refer to people as utter skeptics, oftentimes it's for selfish reasons, because the true utter skeptic is rare, is very hard to find, if if we ever find them. Who we call utter skeptics are oftentimes merely just a disagreeable name that we apply to someone who persists in doubting something that we like or prize, for which we cannot find adequate support. So he's kind of throwing a dig out there, saying that we often don't find true utter skeptics. We find people that we call utter skeptics because we do not have adequate enough evidence to convince them otherwise. And yeah, so he says, the other skeptic, this is the last paragraph, page 10, the utter skeptic has apparently no firmer substance than an empty name, nor any good use. And he then transitions to chapter 2, which is the dogmatist, which will be covered in the next one. Of course, because it's chapter 2, I'm repeating myself. Anyways, oh my god, that was 40 minutes. I don't even know how I got here. That was so quick. Okay, let me think about what I want to say here. I hope you found this summary of this first chapter interesting. Hopefully it made you hopefully give you a better understanding of this material than hopefully you feel like you understand this book a little bit better now as compared to worse. My brain is fried. If you like this video, you don't need to like this video. You don't have to subscribe to this video. You don't have to click the like button, I mean. You don't have to leave a comment. Don't leave a comment here. That's not why I'm here. That's not why I'm doing this. I'm not trying to get big and famous. I'm doing this because I want to support ACBS. And so if you want to support this video and you liked it, then contribute to ACBS. Let's get a post on the listserv. Let's hear your thoughts on the chapter or this video, and let's have the discussion going on over there. And if you really like this, or you found it helpful to approach this chapter, consider showing up to the next meeting where we cover chapter 2 on dogmatists. It is the second Sunday of each month. And if you're there, we would just love to see you. So thank you all so much for your time. And yeah, hopefully this was helpful.